Clipperton Island, also known as L'Île de la Passion, sits alone in the eastern Pacific as a low coral ring around a shallow lagoon. It has no fresh streams, no trees that can form a canopy, and no sheltered anchorage. Surf breaks hard on the reef. A landing depends on timing, weather, and luck. The ground is coral rubble and sand. The horizon is ocean in every direction. The island's small scale does not make it easier. It makes it more complete. There is nowhere to walk that is not still the same exposed place. By the time the colony enters its final years, this geography stops being background and becomes the central fact that shapes every decision. On an atoll, decline is not dramatic. It is procedural. Supplies run down. Tools fail. Bodies weaken. The environment does not change to match the crisis. It stays consistent and indifferent, day after day, and that consistency forces a particular kind of survival. There is no wilderness to retreat into, and no interior to hide resources. What exists is what can be held onto in the open. Clipperton's colony is not a shipwreck story. It is a slow isolation story, one built on administrative distance and interrupted supply. The island is forgotten in the practical way remote places become forgotten. Schedules break, communications stop, and then the gap becomes normal. When that happens on an atoll with a small population, the timeline does not need to be long to become fatal. The remaining record, assembled from later reporting and recollection, shows a community that did not abruptly fail at the start. It endured, reorganized, and then declined through years of cumulative loss. Clipperton had been claimed and reclaimed across the 19th and early 20th centuries. France annexed it in 1858, but Mexico later asserted control and established a small settlement in the early 20th century. In 1905, Mexico placed a military garrison there, with Captain Ram Arnoux as the colony's governor. The settlement was tied to extraction and occupation more than to self-sufficiency. Its endurance depended on a logistical link to the mainland. The colony received supplies from Mexico, often described as arriving about every 2 months, because the island could not provide everything a community needed over time: staples, medicine, clothing, tools, and replacement parts. The colony grew into a mixed community of soldiers, workers, women, and children. By 1914, accounts commonly cite roughly 100 inhabitants on the island. That number matters because it reflects the scale of demand. A small atoll can support limited fishing and bird harvesting, but supporting around 100 people across months and years requires stable imports. Food scarcity can be managed for a short period by rationing, but micronutrient deficiencies accumulate. On isolated islands, scurvy becomes the predictable illness of interrupted supply. It is not sudden. It is a slow, weakening pressure that turns ordinary tasks into risks. Then the external system failed. The Mexican Revolution disrupted governance and shipping. Resupply stopped. The colony became dependent on what it had already stored and what it could extract locally. The men were tasked with the most dangerous labor, attempting to reach help, making landings, maintaining any boats, and working around the surf. Some left the island seeking assistance and did not return. The colony's effective population began to shrink, and with each death or disappearance, the burden of work redistributed among fewer people. This is the essential context for the title, Survival Continued After Years of Decline on a Forgotten Island. The story is not one long emergency. It is years of structural weakening, followed by a last phase where survival continues despite collapse. It is documented as a case where, by the end, the surviving group was primarily women and children, and where the last man on the island became a central figure in the final breakdown. The chronology that matters most runs through 1914 to 1917, ending with a rescue that is precisely dated in several accounts. 18 July 1917, when survivors were taken off the island by the U.S. Navy gunboat Yorktown. The point of no return on Clipperton is not a storm landfall or a single catastrophic event. It is the moment isolation becomes the default condition. After resupply ceased, the colony moved from contingency planning to long-term scarcity. A community can live through a missed shipment. It can adapt to a delay. But when the next ship also does not come, and the next after that, the settlement begins to consume its future. Deaths from illness, particularly scurvy, appear consistently in summaries of the Clipperton case. Scurvy is both a medical condition and a logistical diagnosis. It indicates the sustained absence of fresh foods that contain vitamin C. Over time, people become less capable of work and more vulnerable to infection. Physical decline then feeds operational decline. Fewer people can fish, fewer can maintain equipment, fewer can attempt voyages to seek help. As the colony contracted, the social structure shifted. Authority that had been formal, military command under Arnaud, became harder to sustain as people died and supplies failed. In the later phase, accounts identify Victoriano Alvarez, the lighthouse keeper, as the last surviving adult man on the island. This fact is repeated across multiple summaries because it explains the colony's final internal imbalance: one man, many women, and children, with no external oversight and no practical route away. The point of no return is reached when the population can no longer maintain both survival and governance. On Clipperton, this appears in the sequence where men attempting escape or seeking aid do not return, the governor dies, and the remaining community is left without a functioning chain of command and without a predictable resupply schedule. From that point, survival continues, but it becomes survival after collapse. Systematic survival on Clipperton was shaped by constraints that did not change: limited land area, limited materials, salt exposure, and a lagoon environment that was not a dependable freshwater source. The island could offer protein. It could not reliably offer the full balance needed for health. The colony therefore had to operate on two tracks: immediate calories and longer-term stability, even as the long-term track steadily eroded. Food acquisition would have centered on what the island could produce day after day. Fishing in reef conditions demands skill and carries risk, especially for weakened people. Bird life on isolated atolls can be abundant, and eggs can supplement diets, though dependence on birds is also seasonal and vulnerable to overharvesting. The settlement's earlier period had been sustained by imported staples. Once those ran down, local harvesting became primary. In that shift, the tasks become repetitive: collect, clean, cook, ration, preserve if possible, and then repeat. The system is labor, and labor depends on bodies that are already declining. Water management on a coral atoll is the quiet center of survival. Even when rain falls, capture and storage require containers that do not leak, remain clean, and can be protected from contamination. On Clipperton, the documented record emphasizes deprivation and illness rather than engineering details, so specific methods of water storage are not consistently described across accessible summaries. Where the record is unclear, it is safer to state only the constraint. Without consistent resupply, fresh water would have been managed through rainfall capture and rationing, with constant exposure to spoilage and shortage. The lack of detailed, consistent descriptions in the available summaries is itself an indicator of what survives in the archive, not daily technique, but the endpoints: illness, death, and rescue. Shelter on Clipperton was not about building from raw resources. It was about maintaining what had already been established. Salt air corrodes metal. Fabric rots. Wood splits. In a settlement that began with imported materials, survival later becomes a matter of repair, reusing nails, preserving tools, restitching clothing, extending the life of containers, and keeping a few functional implements from failing all at once. Decline is felt through objects as much as through bodies. A pot breaks and cooking changes. A knife rusts away, and preparation slows. A lantern fails, and night becomes longer and more dangerous to move through. Medical survival is rarely dramatic and often documented only when it fails. With scurvy, the pattern is predictable: bleeding gums, weakness, joint pain, and eventually incapacity. When the colony's supply line collapsed, medical stores would also have been finite. Even if some medicines were present, their use could not substitute for a missing diet. The record of the Clipperton case, as summarized in modern accounts, repeatedly returns to scurvy because it explains why people who were not starving in the immediate sense still died. The island could yield food. The problem was the wrong kind of food for too long. Social survival, keeping a community functioning, requires rules and enforcement. Early in the colony's life, the presence of a governor and soldiers imposed structure. In the later period, after years of decline, structure becomes fragile. When accounts describe Alvarez as the last man and as a violent ruler, they are describing not only individual cruelty, but also the absence of counterweight. In a small, isolated group, the loss of multiple adult men changes the balance of defense, labor division, and the ability to resist coercion. The documentary record repeatedly states that Alvarez terrorized the remaining women and children. While details vary by retelling, the consistent documented claim is that he used force and that the remaining group could not leave. Systematic survival in this phase therefore includes a grim administrative reality. Survival depended not only on food and water, but on managing internal threat. The women and children are described as the remaining core of the community. Their survival required daily maintenance and also avoidance, reducing exposure to violence while still performing necessary tasks. The sources that recount the final stage make clear that there was no neutral outside authority. The island's isolation allowed abuse to persist until it was interrupted from within. Within this long middle stretch, the colony system becomes smaller and smaller. It is a pattern common to documented survival incidents on isolated islands. The system begins as a community. It becomes a group. It becomes a few individuals coordinating survival tasks. The title's phrase, "Years of Decline," fits this progression because decline is not only a drop in numbers, it is a reduction in redundancy. When one person falls ill, there is no replacement. When one tool breaks, there is no substitute. Each loss makes the next loss more likely. The record of Clipperton's final years is also shaped by what the survivors were later able or willing to report, and by what later writers selected for emphasis. Some accounts focus heavily on Alvarez's tyranny. Others foreground the colony's earlier logistical failure and scurvy. Both are part of the same survival reality. A community weakened by disease and isolation becomes less able to resist internal domination. The island's remoteness did not create violence by itself. It removed checks that might have stopped it. The escalation on Clipperton is the moment when deprivation stops being the primary danger and human threat becomes the central one. By 1917, accounts state that Alvarez was the only adult man left. They also state that he murdered and raped, and that he declared himself king in some retellings. The exact phrasing varies by source, but the consistent historical claim is that his rule was violent and that the remaining women and children lived under coercion. This phase is the collapse of social order after the collapse of supply. Loss on Clipperton is not a single tally, it is a long reduction from a colony of roughly 100 by 1914 to a small group by mid-1917. The causes, as commonly summarized, include scurvy, failed attempts to seek help, and violence in the last stage. Some accounts describe that the women and children left alive at the end numbered around 15, before the final sequence resolved into fewer survivors rescued. The most consistently repeated rescue figure is 4 women and 7 children rescued on 18 July 1917. Other sources describe 3 women and 8 children. This discrepancy appears across retellings. When a survival record contains both numbers, a documentary approach treats that as uncertainty rather than choosing one for neatness. What is stable across sources is that the survivors were women and children, and that the rescue occurred on 18 July 1917 by the US Yorktown. In the final internal turning point, accounts identify one woman by name, Terza Rendon. Multiple summaries state that she killed Alvarez, ending his control. This act is often presented as the decisive internal break that allowed the remaining group to survive until rescue. The record is plain in its outline. The last man died before rescue, and after his death, the remaining survivors were women and children who endured until a ship arrived. This is escalation without spectacle. It is failure accumulated into a final crisis. A remote colony did not receive supplies. Disease reduced the population. Attempts to reach help failed. Authority collapsed. Violence filled the vacuum. The end of that violence did not end hardship. It simply removed an added threat layered onto deprivation. After that, survival continued in its most reduced form, waiting while sustaining basic life, with no certainty that the outside world still remembered the island at all. Rescue, when it comes in survival history, often arrives without ceremony. For Clipperton, the rescue date is specific in multiple accounts, 18 July 1917. The rescuing vessel is also consistently identified, the U.S. Navy gunboat Yorktown. The arrival did not restore what had been lost. It ended isolation. It removed survivors from an environment that had become structurally unlivable for a small community without support. The survivors taken off the island are described as women and children. As noted, the exact count varies in common retellings, often 4 women and 7 children, sometimes 3 women and 8 children. The existence of this discrepancy is not unusual in events transmitted through limited records and later narrative accounts. What can be said cleanly, without invention, is that only a small group remained and that the adult survivors were women. Resolution here is not triumph, it is extraction. The island does not release people. Ships remove them. The colony ends not with a rebuilding plan, but with abandonment of the abandonment. When the survivors left, the settlement ceased to be a lived-in place and returned to being what the atoll had been before the garrison, a remote ring of coral that could be claimed on paper but could not sustain ordinary life without a stable external system. Clipperton's story is sometimes summarized as a cautionary tale about tyranny on an island. That is only one layer. The deeper structure is administrative and environmental. A small colony was established in a place that could not support it without reliable logistics. When that logistics chain failed, because of revolution and distance, decline set in. Illness followed predictable lines. Death reduced capacity. Capacity loss increased vulnerability. The final moral horror, described in the accounts of Alvarez's violence, unfolded within that weakened framework. The phrase "forgotten island" fits Clipperton because forgetting is not always an active decision. It can be a bureaucratic drift. A schedule breaks, and then no one has the ability or priority to repair it. The island keeps the consequences. Those consequences are measured in bodies, in the reduction of a community to a few survivors, and in the final fact that, by the time help arrived, survival had continued through years of decline rather than through a single disaster. The rescue on 18 July 1917 closes the survival incident, but it does not resolve the larger story of claims and distance. Clipperton would later be the subject of sovereignty arbitration, and it remains an example of how remote territory can be treated as an object while human life on it depends on ordinary fragile systems, supply, medicine, governance, and accountability. On a low atoll in open water, when those systems fail, the environment does not need to become hostile. It only needs to remain what it already is.